Ever since Disney acquired Star Wars back in 2012, there seems to be pretty much only one thing everybody in the fandom can agree on: that their handling of it hasn't been the best. The movies have ranged from divisive to just plain hated, and the TV shows released on Disney Plus have also been extremely hit or miss. But despite that, there is one Star Wars show that seems to have been praised across the board by fans and critics alike, which is, of course, Andor, a prequel series to Rogue One showing the early days of the Rebellion and Empire. But the thing is, I think a lot of people are overlooking, or even downright missing, a couple of problems this show has. And I'm not trying to argue about quality here. That's not the issue. And somewhat surprisingly, I'm also not going to default onto the main criticism most people give it, that it doesn't feel like Star Wars. Instead, I would like to go over a few issues with this show that nobody seems to be talking about or even considering, and how that in and of itself is a problem. And there will not be spoilers for Andor ahead, as I will be talking about the show in general terms only, so no specific plot points or story beats will be mentioned. There will, however, be some spoilers for a few of the Star Wars movies ahead, so in case you haven't seen any of them yet, you might just want to be careful. Okay. So to get right into it, the issue with Andor that nobody seems to be addressing is that it can never be the standard for Star Wars. Now, before you start running to the comments to say it, once again, I am not referring to quality here. Everything in Star Wars, and anything else worth being good for that matter, should always be of the utmost quality no matter what it is. And as I also said before, it isn't because it doesn't feel like Star Wars either. I mean, in many ways it arguably doesn't, but that's not the problem I'm referring to. The problem lies in its tone and target audience. Because here's the thing. When dealing with a franchise like Star Wars, a show like Andor, or even a movie like Rogue One is okay to have once in a while. But if it becomes the gold standard for how all things in the franchise are modeled on going forward, then it simply wouldn't be Star Wars anymore. And why wouldn't it be, you might ask? Well, for two reasons. Because one, George Lucas has always said that Star Wars is for kids. He has openly said he made the first Star Wars movie for, quote, 12-year-old boys, and when asked for advice while filming The Mandalorian, Lucas told Dave Filoni not to forget about the children, and heavily stressed that was the most important thing to Star Wars, that it be for children. And the second reason is that Star Wars has always been about good versus evil. Again, in the words of Lucas, if paraphrased this time, Star Wars is about both good people standing up against evil to do what's right no matter what, and about the inner conflict of good and evil we all have inside all of us. That's even part of the whole point of the light and dark sides of the Force, to be a metaphor or physical manifestation of that conflict inside each and every one of us. And the thing is, Andor is neither of these things in nature. Now, to get the simpler of the two out of the way first, the whole point of the Empire and Rebellion dynamic is that one side is supposed to be the good side, and the other is supposed to be the evil side. So if the good side is depicted as having to do a bunch of horrible things in order to achieve victory, then what's the point of rooting for any side at all? I mean, showing Cassian shooting his informant in Rogue One was already pushing the limits, but Andor takes it way too far in this regard. Because while it might be realistic, it completely misses the point of what Star Wars is about, the conflict between good and evil. So if the good side has to do truly evil, terrible things, then they are no longer the good guys. That's simply the way it works in George Lucas's Star Wars. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes the Jedi have to push their moral boundaries to do what they must, but the thing there is, they never take it too far over the edge, because they know where to firmly draw the line. As the old saying goes, if you have to become your enemy in order to achieve victory, then it's a victory not worth having. And that is a philosophy that is very present in Star Wars. So to depict the rebellion as doing things just as bad as the Empire, even if it is for the right reasons, completely goes against that. Again, Star Wars is very obviously not based off realism, and a major theme is good versus evil. So you can't depict the good guys as doing terrible things and still keep that fundamental principle behind the franchise intact, at least not for long. And of course, there's the whole kids argument, which as frequent viewers of my channel will know, is a subject I touch on often. But once again, even if nobody else will say it, I will, because it's something that needs to be said. Star Wars is for children. The creator himself has explicitly said this on many occasions. Again, that doesn't mean it can't be good, or that it shouldn't be well written. All that means is that it should be made with entertaining children and teaching them something in mind first and foremost. And once again, this is something Andor doesn't do in the slightest, clearly being made for an adult audience to the point that they wanted to put in the freaking F word. Now, before some of you guys go running to the comments to accuse me of being a hypocrite, yes, I do understand that even George Lucas himself sometimes went pretty adult and dark with Star Wars, but there's a very important difference here. Because Revenge of the Sith, for example, had to be the way it was in order to bring the story to its logical conclusion. To put it simply, George Lucas had somewhat backed himself into a corner when it came to the kind of story he could tell. As Anakin had to fall to the dark side, the Jedi had to be wiped out, and the Emperor had to take over the Republic. So knowing all of that, Lucas had two options. Either he could sugarcoat and dumb it down, or he could embrace the apocalyptic tragedy of what happens and really get his point across to the viewer. And he wisely chose to take the second route. But again, he only did that out of necessity. As I just said, in order to truly get across what he was trying to say, he simply had to embrace the darker elements of the story. There simply was no other way around it at that point. And before somebody counters by saying that Andor is also as dark as it is out of necessity, the original trilogy's mere existence proves that isn't the case. Those movies show how to depict an Empire and Rebellion dynamic while also keeping it pretty child-friendly. Especially because when it does get darker, it focuses more on the sacrifices that must be made in the name of victory, and not the terrible acts of the alleged good side. Because, like I said before, Star Wars is supposed to be a tale of good versus evil, so the good side always remains the good side in George Lucas's Star Wars, even in his darker movies, because it's not supposed to be realistic in that regard. And speaking of his darker movies, Revenge of the Sith is really the only one that stands out. Even The Empire Strikes Back, which is often said to be the darkest of the original trilogy, still remains firmly in the camp of being appropriate for children at all times. Sure, maybe it gets a little intense or deep, but it can still be labeled as children's entertainment, if something that adults are likely to take a bit more away from as well. But to be fair, Andor isn't the only thing in Star Wars to suffer from this issue. Like I said, even Rogue One was pushing it to the limits in that regard, but if nothing else, it doesn't focus nearly as much on the evil the good side does, and more on the sacrificial end like George Lucas did. But again, it still pushes it further than it arguably should have. And of course, there's the entire sequel trilogy, which feels as if they were gunning for a PG-13 rating just for the sake of it, and considered the kids about as much as they considered the trilogy's narrative. Now, as I've noted in other videos, I do believe that one of the sequel trilogy's biggest problems is that they don't feel like movies made for children. And as I said at the start, to not be made for children is to not be Star Wars. And as I've already spoke about at length, Andor is just as guilty of this. But what arguably makes it even worse in this regard is that Andor is not only adult-oriented, but very well made, which is inclined to make some adults love it in part because it's more mature than other good things in Star Wars. But those who believe this are completely missing the point that Star Wars was made for children. So if they're going to watch it, then they're going to have to accept that. Because when you really think about it, how much is a child going to like Andor? There were complaints from adults that half the episodes are pretty slow. So how is a child going to feel about it? The only thing most would probably take away from it was that it was one of the most boring things they'd ever seen. When it's not being too upsetting for them, that is. And I just have to say it. Is that really fair to them? Now, as I've said before, I know I've made this argument in what feels like half my videos on this channel, but I do believe that the children have to be considered when it comes to their own entertainment. It's not fair to them that adults would rather see children's movies be made for them rather than be more focused on whether or not the kids who it was made for like it. Because, to put it simply, children and adults are different. What appeals to them is going to be, to a degree, different. And if something is supposed to be made for children, then adults should be accepting or even welcoming of the fact that it was made more for the kids than for them. But if anything, the exact opposite seems to be true across the board. Because as I've been saying since day one, Pixar makes their movies mostly for adults, not children, and they get a ton of love for it. And Andor is praised by some as the best thing in Star Wars ever, and it just so happens to be perhaps the most mature and child-unfriendly content in the entire franchise. And once again, is that really fair to the children that this content is supposed to be made for? Especially because if you ask me, the adults are almost worse than the children when it comes to what they want to see from their entertainment. You want proof? How come animation, and especially traditional animation, still has such a hard time getting any respect? because many adults assume that it's all just made for kids. There are thousands of fully grown adults out there who won't watch outright masterpieces of visual and written storytelling because they won't watch anything that they think is for kids. And this is even true of Star Wars itself. How many die-hard Star Wars fans have refused to watch the Clone Wars TV series simply because it's animated and therefore for kids? Because I know most of you watching this know that these people exist, and not a small number at that. Or how many people hated the prequels because of their somewhat childish qualities, but refused to admit that maybe there might be something more to them than that. And yet, if you put a child in the same situation, they're open to watching almost anything, even more adult content, and will only make final judgment once they've started watching. Now, which one sounds more childish to you? Because it seems to me that ironically, adults can act quite a bit like children when it comes to what they want to see in their entertainment. I mean, look at some of the immature but R-rated stuff made these days, and yet they still insist that children's entertainment must be mature for them to like it, or even consider watching it? But if you ask me, where this is worst in Star Wars is in Return of the Jedi. Because I'm just going to say it right now. I unironically believe that Return of the Jedi is the greatest Star Wars movie ever made, and one of the best made movies of all time in general. Especially when it comes to the final confrontation between Luke, Darth Vader, and the Emperor. Seriously, the way that's all written and the beauty of Vader's redemption simply cannot be overstated, to the point that it might just be the greatest redemption story in all of cinema. And that's only compounded by one of the best battle scenes ever put to film in the fantasy genre. Because they had so little CGI to work with, it makes everything feel more authentic. And yet, many people are willing to write everything brilliant about this movie off for one simple reason: the Ewoks. And really, the fact that people view this movie as an inferior addition to the Star Wars franchise over a tribe of teddy bears baffles my mind. I mean, even if what Lucas was going for, which was having primitive people overcome the more technologically advanced Empire, didn't quite translate the best on screen, it still makes for one heck of a battle. Especially because the Ewoks do prove themselves to be more competent than people give them credit for. But just because they're cute, many people will write them and the entire movie off just because they believe they were put there to pander to children and are therefore annoying. And I just have to say it again, doesn't that ironically sound pretty childish? To put it all another way, after Andor came out, it made some even speculate if Star Wars needs to grow up a bit. And if you ask me, Star Wars is just fine the way it is. It's the fans that need to grow up and accept that not everything can be made strictly for adults, especially in a franchise like this. Alright. So to get back on topic here, and sorry for that little side rant, my point is that Andor can't be the gold standard for Star Wars, and in no way what Star Wars should strive to be going forward. Again, quality is one thing, but the fundamental nature behind it is another thing entirely, as it pretty much goes exactly against everything George Lucas meant Star Wars to be. So if everything in Star Wars became like Andor, then it wouldn't be Star Wars anymore. Or to use an analogy for those of you who might not get it, think about it like this. If Pixar, at least old school Pixar, tried to make a John Wick movie, how would it turn out? Because John Wick is all about R-rated action, while Pixar is all about telling compelling, emotionally satisfying PG-rated stories. So if they were to make a John Wick movie, many might say it was the greatest John Wick movie they had ever seen, but that it still can't become the mold for other John Wick movies to follow, because that's not what the franchise is about. And if all future movies did follow that, then they would be Pixar movies, not John Wick movies anymore. Because again, at the end of the day, John Wick is all about R-rated action, not an emotional story, no matter how good that story may be. And it's the same thing here with Andor. It may be a well-told story, but it's not something that Star Wars can ever be if it wants to truly remain Star Wars. Alright, I think I've gone on about this for long enough. So now I'd like all of you to tell me, do you believe that Andor's level of maturity and lack of black and white morality are issues that nobody's talking about in regards to it? Or do you think I've got it all completely wrong? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please remember you are under no obligation to agree with me or any of my opinions in this video. And thank you all for watching. I really greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.